What's happening, guys? Welcome to a Zoom roundtable here. My name is Mike Trudell. Pete Zayas and Joey Ramirez kind to join me on this platform as always. And guys, we figured we're going to do kind of two things here. And the main is to summarize what we saw from the 2021 Lakers season that, of course, did not end as they would have wished, and talk about how much of that had to do with the previous season. And then, as is the point with any time that we talk, okay, what's the point? Like, where are they going to go from here? What can we learn from what we saw in this season, and how can that be applicable for the next season, which, by the way, all of a sudden isn't that far away. Guys, I just saw the preseason schedule, and that got me all excited. So for the first time in a little bit, as we've been all watching the rest of these playoff games. So, Pete, I'm going to start with you for a general thought and a general summary of what we just watched, all of the context included of the 2020-21 Lakers season.
This will be one of the seasons that got away for me as a Laker fan, right? Like those happen every once in a while, like one where you have high hopes and just you couldn't gain our footing. And that after AD's injury on Valentine's Day, we never got more than, him and LeBron never played more than 3 straight games together after that. They only did it once, games 1, 2, and 3 of the first round, right? So never more than twice during the regular season were they in the same game together. And there was so much talent on this team, but ultimately we weren't able to see them really build that much cohesion and chemistry. So it makes for an interesting dilemma in terms of going into next year of how much do you change when the talent was there, but they didn't get an opportunity to play together. But if you completely blame it on injuries, you may be missing on some opportunities to improve the team. So I think Rob Pelinka has a very interesting job ahead of him in terms of evaluating what just happened, in terms of what to blame on injuries and what to tweak in terms of the roster.
Joey, the way that I've been trying to describe this season in as succinct as way possible is that the Lakers basically paid the bubble tax for the run that they made through October 11th, of course, when they won Game 6 against Miami. We saw this also have effects on many other teams in Miami and Boston that lost in the first round, Denver that got swept in round 2 after they battled out to kind of hang on and win a tough first round series against a flawed and injured Portland team. And so that's kind of to Pete's point there. How much of it is just that bubble tax? And this was going to be to some degree inevitable to ask these guys to continue to play at that level for that long without the kind of usual breaks that you might get in the calendar. And whether it was injuries to AD or LeBron, or even just the guys like Caruso and KCP and Kuzma that we saw start to break down physically, as really almost everybody in the NBA has or did at that level that played that far, the extra, even if it was an extra 2 weeks, Joey, in October, or an extra month from September to October, that seems like that did make all the difference. So with that said, like, how do you take that? And how did you think that implicated what we saw in the season?
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. I think that you can't unlink the two seasons, the 1920 season and the 2021 season. They are very much intertwined to a degree that no other pair of seasons has ever been. And I also think that, anybody who follows the Lakers, I mean, to me, that 2020 championship was just so special, given that it did happen in the middle of the pandemic, right in the thick of it. I know, everybody has a different experience as it pertains to the pandemic, but really, I mean, in my eyes, for that to happen in such a dark time, when there was such little to look forward to, not just in sports, but just in general, like that championship is special in my opinion. And I know it's different. Everybody wants to win in front of their home fans on their home court, packed Staples Center. And it was different in the bubble, obviously, but I do think that there is a special place for that chip. Now, in particular, as it pertains to this season, I look at Anthony Davis and I look at a guy who I have high hopes and expectations for moving forward. Surprise, surprise, right? I believe in Anthony Davis, breaking news. But to the degree that AD played during that championship run, I thought so much of that was intertwined with his mid-range just being at an insane level. In the first round, he shot something ridiculous, like 65% from mid-range. I think throughout the playoffs, he was hovering around 50%. And that mid-range wasn't there for the regular season and for the short playoff run, right? And it might be easy to say, like, hey, mid-range is one shot, right? But I think it actually speaks to how much development AD still has to do. And I think that it's what really does give me hope in that context is that he was dominant in those 2 Phoenix games that they did win in the first round. And to Pete's point, I mean, that does speak to what could have been. But the fact that he didn't have his jumper going and he was still that dominant, back-to-back 34-point games in back-to-back wins, I really do think that the Lakers had something on there. And I think it's easy to look back on a season where you get bounced in the first round and say, oh, we have to change this, we have to change that, we have to change that. And that's not to say that there should be complacency and things shouldn't change. But what I think it's also you should also take a very high level view, especially as it pertains to AD, because that man was getting ready to go on a playoff tear. And it just so happens that, injuries can strike at any minute. But for the 21-22 season, my eyes are very much locked into Anthony Davis. I think he's going to have a monster year on both sides of the ball.
Joey, it's a really good way to transition into well, I don't want to say transition, just to go directly from what you were saying with AD and kind of to Pete's point earlier about how the season feels like it's the one that got away to an extent. And that's because we're watching Phoenix play Milwaukee in the finals right now and thinking, yeah, the Lakers were up 2-1. They had that first half where things were starting to click a little bit. LeBron gets the alley-oop off the glass from Caruso. And then a couple of moments after that is when the groin gets injured. But with AD specifically, Pete, I'm really curious about this offseason because I think we all know now what to expect from LeBron, especially when he has a full offseason. There's nobody that seems to know better how to get his body ready. And in fact, he did, even in these ridiculous circumstances in which he had the 2 months basically between the start of the preseason and that October 11th game. And yet he was playing in MVP form somehow in year 18. So the only thing that happened, of course, was Solomon Hill dove into the leg, and we don't need to relitigate that. So Anthony Davis, on the other hand, hadn't been through stuff like that before. He wasn't quite, to his own admission, ready to play, whether it was physically, mentally, whatever. And he was still a top 10 player, but maybe he had slipped from that top 5 player that Joey described in the bubble. So that is the question to you now. What are you expecting from AD with now a more traditional offseason and, with the chance to make a big jump from what his level was in the 2020-21 season?
Yeah, I think just the opportunity to
2021, I should say. Yeah,
right.
We don't want to go back another century yet. That's
no. So just being on a regular schedule, I think, is really going to be helpful for him physically. I think that, like you said, LeBron was able to hit the ground running on this season, and in some ways, the team did as well. I thought, for all of the talk that we've had of the bubble tax, we actually began the season quite strongly, especially with our shooting, and I think in part that's because they were playing high-level basketball more recently than most champions did.
In so better rhythm, right?
Yeah. Right. So you'd have a better rhythm at the front end, and then you pay the price for it on the back end. And that's what we saw happen with this season. AD, though, was never really fit that description. He kind of was in second gear to start the season, and for good reason. Right? I think that as the years progress and we're going into year 3 of Anthony Davis, the older LeBron gets, the more reliant we become on AD's physical dominance, right? LeBron is going to be dominant in part because he's mentally mastered the game in ways that others have not. And obviously he's in great shape and physical condition, but that's exactly to the point with AD, is like getting into just having the time and the rest, the time to rest, the time to get into great shape, the time to really physically get himself in the best position is going to be more important as the time and the years go by, because we need to rely on LeBron less and less to have to do that. And so that's what I view this longer and more conventional offseason for AD. I think that will help him get to that place. And I'm with Joey. I'm expecting big things next season.
So, Joey, over on the Laker Film Room pod that, of course, Pete and Darius started, we were having this discussion about shooting versus two-way players. And I think that Pete and I kind of came to the same conclusion that if you got to pick between the two, right, a pure shooter versus a two-way guy, Pete, we both take the two-way player. And so, Joey, I do want to get your thought on this, because I think if you just look at the numbers, or even if you just casually watch the Lakers last year, you're like, the shooting really went away, and not just in that regular season part that we mentioned kind of from February on. I thought it was highlighted by the 3 straight overtime games against weaker teams when the Lakers just, couldn't hit a shot but found a way to win, right, because those other teams struggled. And then we saw that proliferate certainly in the postseason. But when you're thinking about the roster construction, and we won't get into specific players, but how do you see what the Lakers had this past season compared to what the core is with LeBron and with AD and with the other guys that are under contract? How do you see that roster? How do you see the shooting versus the two-way players and all of that shaping out, which could, by the way, include the center position, right? Do you go stretch? Do you go classic, rim runner? And so tie all that together for us, please, Joey Ramirez.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, huge fan of the Laker Film Room podcast. And I've actually been thinking about this very point quite a bit because you guys have gone back and forth on it. I see everyone's point. Here's where I net out on it. I took a look back at the 2020 team and how they shot in the postseason. So Markieff Morris, 42%, Rajon Rondo, 40%, Anthony Davis, 38%, KCP, 38%, LeBron, 37%. Now, with the exception of KCP, I would say all of those guys, you wouldn't qualify as shooters, right? Like you wouldn't call Rondo a shooter. You wouldn't call AD a shooter. AD has some shooting touch, right? LeBron, he has added a shooting element to his game and over the last few years. But you don't think shooter when you think of those guys. So what that tells me is you need people who have complete games, but part of that complete game is the ability to get hot and to be a knockdown shooter as long as they're hot in the playoffs. And if they go cold in the playoffs, then you just need to find the next guy who will have that hot hand. What I think needs to be avoided is having too many guys that are non-shooters, that you will never get that hot streak from player X or player Y. A guy like Markieff Morris shot way above his three-point percentage in that playoff run, his career three-point percentage, his season three-point percentage. But that's the kind of player that Markieff is. He can get hot and he can give you, a 2 weeks worth of really great shooting. And so I think that's kind of where I net out. I'm not, maybe this is wishy-washy. Maybe this is me finding the gray area between you guys. But I really do think that the key there is to find guys who can get hot for extended periods of time. And to then it's in the coach's hands to handle the rotation and to realize, hey, Markieff is, he's knocked down right now. Let me get him out there versus, AD's mid-range is working. So let's put him in spots to let him succeed. But I do really think that shooting, it's almost like in the NHL where they say the key to any playoff run is a hot goalie, right? The key to a lot of NBA playoff runs, I do believe, is hot shooting. And you need the personnel to shoot hot. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go out and just get every shooter available, because even the best shooters do go cold in the playoffs, and they do they can be schemed against. So I wouldn't say it's a heavy shooter turn, but I do think that there is an element there.
In part of the way that Frank Vogel would describe this, Pete, and I think just pulling from all of the pre and the post game, like whenever he speaks, is what you can control, and coaches always want to have as much control as possible, right, is the defensive scheme and energy and effort. And that's the thing that the Lakers did do great. Like, we should point that out. When we talk about this past Lakers season, they finished number one in defense despite not having Anthony Davis for over half the season, despite not having LeBron James for over a month. They're two best defenders. And they did it in multiple different ways, but mostly just by engaging and believing in the scheme and buying in, and because they have the athleticism and they have guys that can kind of play on both ends. And to Joey's point with the shooting, to me, a lot of that reflects, Pete, to kick this to you, is how much does a defense have to respect you? And so what Joey just said, if you're a non-shooter, that means you can clog the lane and take away some space that LeBron or AD specifically may want to get into, and to an extent, shooter. And if you've got a guy, like I always think Wes Matthews is a good example for this. So he's not necessarily he's not like a knockdown 45% every time you see him, he's open. But the defense is going to look at him and they're thinking, he's going to shoot this. I have to get out there. Danny Green was much the same way. So those guys are streaky, Pete, but they have to be respected enough to give LeBron the space that he needs. And then guess what? They can defend on the other end.
Absolutely. And that's something that, just from a functional sense, do I have to close out to you, and how concerned do I have to be as I'm doing it? That pulls that defender out of the paint in a way that does open those lanes, as you said, for LeBron. And so just that baseline respect, it even has more to do with reputation even than percentages. And one thing that I think impacted our shooters is basketball is such a rhythm sport. And I think that shooting it's more reflective of that than ever. So as you were reading off those numbers, Joey, I was like, those are good numbers for those guys. But in part, that's because they're together. There was that cohesion. They were playing. Knowing where your shot is coming from is really critical for a shooter. When and where, and there's a rhythm to it that guys get used to. We see that with Phoenix, where Cam Johnson, Bridges, all those guys are getting shots that they've shot over and over and over again from the same type of pass from CP3 or Booker, or they've done it thousands of times this season between games and practices, that you get a rhythm and a familiarity that this team was never able to establish. So I think that we'll see a bump in our shooting just as a natural, knock on wood, if we stay healthy. I do think, though, to coin a term from our guy Darius, we need one more 3-and-D guy rather than a lot of the D-and-3 guys that we have. I think that just a little tweak of the dial, I think, would be helpful to us. But I don't think we need to change much on that front.
And the thing that I would add, Pete, to that, and I forget now if it was Pelinka or Vogel that mentioned this, and maybe both of them did, but it's to Joey's point about the percentages in the postseason. Well, when you have LeBron and AD on the floor, those shots are going to be more open. And this season, to Pete's earlier point, they almost never, after February 12th, or I guess February 14th, right, when AD went down, they almost never had both of those guys on the court at the same time. And once you got into the Phoenix series, you started to see game two and game three, the shots were starting to become wide open because AD was putting that pressure on the rim. Phoenix had to adjust to that. And we know they're already going to do that with LeBron. So that's a big piece of it, too, I think, that they could build on. Okay, so a couple names I want to get to, guys, before we get out of here in a little bit. Taylon Horton Tucker, his development this season, Alex Caruso. Of course, we'll have to wait and see what happens as these guys enter a free agency period, different in some ways, but nonetheless, like these are guys that came up in the Lakers system. So TSG, they, of course, draft number 46 overall. We've seen what his growth has been. Alex Caruso proved himself. We know what Frank Vogel thought when he started him in Game 6 of the finals. And I just wonder, Joey, to start with you, what did you see from their development, and where do you think that can continue to go as we think about how they pair with LeBron and with Anthony Davis?
Yeah, it's so interesting because they're such different players. You have a guy like THG who, he has such flair to his game. Pete, you and I had a conversation earlier, and one thing that stuck out to me was you saying I can't even find a comp for this guy. He plays like nobody I've ever seen. And Pete's watched more basketball than just about it. Actually, maybe the two of you might have to go head to head in terms of who's watched the most basketball in my life. But for Pete to say that, hey,
I watch a lot of basketball live. Pete watches a lot more basketball live, and then again after to break things out further. So just to make that distinction point,
fair enough. So yeah, Taylon, I mean, he's a guy who has so many tools, unique tools, by the way, too. His wingspan is we make a lot of a big deal about it, but wingspan does matter in the NBA. It gives him some, it's one of the reasons why he's able to get to the cup the way he does, finish, reverse off the glass. And I think he does have more defensive potential than he's shown in his first 2 years for sure. And he's a guy that, his jump shot did not fall this year. And it's one of those things where I think jump shooting is a hard thing to learn in the NBA. Just look at a guy like Ben Simmons, obviously. It is very hard to add that element to your game. So can Taylon do it? Sure. But it's one of those things that needs to be seen. And it's one of those things that would really, truly open up his game and push him to the next level, because his slashing is already at an elite level. And that's top of his scouting report. So if you can knock that down a little bit, then I think it opens up everything. And then, as you said about Alex Caruso, I mean, man, there's a reason why he's a fan favorite. He's one of the smartest defenders I've ever seen. He doesn't get credit. He doesn't get enough credit, in my opinion, for how physical and how just big he is. And then on the offensive end, I think he's a great pairing with LeBron James. There's a reason why their net ratings tend to be among the best on the team, if not the league. AC is an interesting one, though, because he is a guy that I wonder what is the next stage of his development. And I would probably pass that back to you, Mike, or to Pete, whichever one of you guys wants to take that. But where does Alex Caruso go from here?
Yeah, jump on that, Pete.
Yeah, so Alex, his on-ball skills have progressed throughout throughout the last couple of seasons, where he was basically one of those 3-and-D guys. And now more and more we're seeing side ball screens with him and LeBron. He's not just a screen setter, but he's somebody that can drive and kick. He's gotten better at his decisions. His ball handling has improved. But Alex is also somebody that he's gonna continue to improve and continue to work on his game. But I think we'd all agree he's closer to what he will be than Taylon. And to me, Taylon is the player that represents our biggest opportunity for internal growth on the team. Is since he already has that elite skill and those elite measurables, with you put the wingspan alongside, he's a good 225, he's strong, solid guy. with ball handling ability and his footwork. When you slow down the up close shots from the melts and all that, and you see his toe dragging across the top of the court and the ankle flexion that he gets where he can turn his foot like parallel to the ground. He does some really cool stuff that guys with those measurables almost never do. However, learning to shoot at the NBA level with a wingspan the way that he has can be a bit challenging. We saw this with Brandon Ingram. It's also that he's also a guy that can represent a certain degree of encouraging, an encouraging prospect, because we saw BI become a high 30 shooter in New Orleans. That takes time, but there's a missing link in THT's on-ball game in terms of a shooter, and we saw it come out toward the end of the season, and I'm excited about. I was like, oh, can he get that elbow pull-up? Because that is the counter to his drives to the basket, right? He's going so hard at the basket that you see defenses back on their heels, and they're going to protect against that. The counter is, we're going to pull up right here, shoot this floater, shoot this pull-up. But what Taylon does is, again, this is my fascination with him, is he doesn't use the same moves in the same situations that other guys do. Is he would drive all the way to the rim, plant, and then shoot that turnaround off of a pivot. And like, he was knocking that down in the last month or so of the season. And so there's a certain, like, I think I know where Taylon's going with his game and what the next stages of development are, but it's kind of cool to see the different routes and paths that he takes relative to other guys. But him, more than anything, his passing out of those drives, I think, is even more significant than his jumper. If he can become an okay jump shooter, he's already got an elite skill at 20 and driving to the basket. He'll be fine on that front. I think he's going to be okay. But it's a matter of making those reads and understanding. And Mike, as LeBron gets older, having that second guy that's big and strong, can handle the ball, get to the rack. If he's making his kickouts, that'll alleviate a lot of LeBron's responsibilities.
No question about it. And this is the part where I always feel like we should mention that THT is not 21 yet until next November, right? So, and even Alex Caruso, he's 27. So, like, that's a significant difference in what Pete was talking about earlier with the whole, we all love to talk about in the basketball, like, upside. But that is the thing, is that THT still has shown so much, but yet there's a lot that he can still get to based on the tools that he has. All right, so I wish we had time to go through every single guy in the roster. There's one other guy I want to talk about for a couple moments, though, Kyle Kuzma. And we saw the evolution of his game from when he was a rookie, and he was playing in some ways like THT, right? Where he'd get on the court and he's able to get his own shot. He can do it a little bit more efficiently than some may have expected, but there are some areas of his game that need to grow. And he showed during the championship run, the defense got a lot better. The passing got better, although he said he still wants that to get better. He now wants to focus on the handle this offseason. He wants to get the shooting a little bit more consistent, which it was definitely better in the regular season, but faded and I can describe that, I think, at least personally, to some bubble tax. But let's start with you, Pete, this time, and then Joey, maybe you can wrap it up with Kuz and anybody else you want to get to. What did you make of the way that his year went, and then how you think that could build into next season?
I always refer to Kuz as Kuz the chameleon, right? Because he can be a different player at any given time. But that comes with upsides and downsides. When he was that younger player, this is something Kobe talked about, is his ability to disassociate movements, which means, your upper half's moving this way and your legs are going that way, and you can kind of make these contorting floaters. And Kuz, while he's developed wonderfully as a defender, as a guy that knows how to drive and kick and understanding the theory of basketball, I feel like as he's done that, he's lost some of his feel. And so along with the handles, which is very important to develop in terms of his drive and kick game, but if he can find a way to return to the spirit of himself as a scorer, even if he's as a third option or below in, a very talented Lakers roster, can he find those? Because he was a bucket getter, man. Those first couple of years, like, he didn't know what he was doing on the defensive end. He's gotten so much better there, but he doesn't have that quite as much, Joey, as he had before. And I'd love to see him be able to do both, because that's what I think his prime will look like.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, Pete. I think he's a guy who, start to finish or start to current where he's been defensively, like, that is commendable. I think that's a lot more progress than anybody really expected out of him in a short amount of time. Just looking back on his sophomore year, he averaged 18.7 points per game, the highest of his career so far. And he was taking 15 and a half shots a game. Now he's down to 11 shots a game. Like, that's significant. That's 4.5 fewer shots. So I do want to kind of bake that in. But to your point, Pete, the thing that made me, and I think most people, fall in love with Kuzma in those first 2 years was how he got buckets. it wasn't just, the spot up shooting. It wasn't just, a backdoor layup. Like, he had a hook shot to him. He had footwork. He had, spin moves. And he just had such a deep bag that it seemed like, all right, if he's here in year 1, year 2, he's already got all this to him. Where is he going to be in 2 to 5 years, right? And I think that the progression has come. It's just coming in a different way. It's come on the defensive end. It's come on, with his basketball IQ. And I really do think that where he is at defensively is so serviceable that I agree with you. I think that if he can go back to, all right, what made me so effective as a scorer in those first 2 years? Those things don't just leave you, right? You can still regrasp them. You can build upon them. I think that that's something that'll really not just endear Kuz back into the fold, but really it'll open up so much more of his game, because that to me, that's why I think somebody like Kobe Bryant was such a mentor to Kuz, is because Kobe's a guy who was detail oriented, footwork oriented, right? And so to see some of that DNA, obviously at a much, nobody's comparing Kuz to Kobe, right? But to see that link between attention to detail as a scorer, I think that is still in there with Kuz at some level. And I think if you were to bring that out of him again next year, like, sky's the limit for Kyle Kuzma.
Well, and Joey, the point that you just made about Kuz too, I think you can extend to almost the entire roster. And with this offseason, now having a chance to actually build back and to add some stuff to the game that was not possible last year. Last year, it was about take a couple weeks to just let your body recover and then take a couple weeks to get back in shape. Like, there was no time to mix in a ton of ball handling work or a ton of pickup games. That was the other thing that, like, one of the best things for Kuz, Pete, to just get that rhythm back, just play some games where you don't have to worry about necessarily the defensive scouting report every night, but you can just kind of work on your craft. So I'm really curious to see how that can impact the whole team as they now have this time where there's still NBA teams playing, but a lot of the stars are going to the Olympics, right? And so, like, the Lakers are now going to be in the position where they have the rest advantage over everybody else. Okay, so look, you guys were great. I could go back and pick your brain on 25 other things, which leads me to say that we will have to come back and we'll do a couple more of these as the offseason continues. But until then, for Joey Ramirez, for Pete Zayas, thanks you guys so much for being here and for hanging out, and we will see you next time.